In March 2012, at the Tri-County Equipment Yard outside Hastings in Adams County, Cole Fisher climbed down from a 1999 Chevrolet Silverado with 312,000 miles, rusted rocker panels, one cracked passenger mirror, and a tailgate that had to be lifted with a knee before it latched. His coveralls were brown once, then sun-faded, with stitched knees and a pocket repaired by hand in darker thread. 3 younger growers were already at the registration table in clean branded jackets, dealership caps, and boots that had not seen much mud that week, and they laughed when Cole asked the auction clerk to read every lien line and salvage disclosure out loud before he raised a hand. One of them, Travis Meek, had driven in with a new diesel pickup carrying a 72-month note at 6.3%. Another, Jordan Hale, had just posted photos of his financed combine upgrade online 2 days earlier. Cole nodded to all of them, said very little, and listened to every word from the clerk as if each sentence had a price tag attached, because to him each one did. The county had already started mistaking appearance for arithmetic. By 2012, local conversation sounded like a single thesis, repeated with confidence. If you could deliver to Prairie Horizon Ethanol, basis strength would carry you through any thin futures board. The premium ranged from 10 cents to 22 cents per bushel, often enough that many treated it as permanent income, then built fixed costs around that assumption. New combines, upgraded grain legs, larger dryers, faster planters, newer trucks, cleaner pictures, bigger payments. Cole kept running a 1978 John Deere 4440 with 11,400 hours, rebuilt injectors, a second clutch, and a seat cushion held together with duct tape and patience. People called that stubborn. What they did not see was that he had paid cash for 640 acres over 26 years, held 0 operating debt, and kept annual family living costs at $28,740, while his mixed corn, soybeans, and custom hay operation grossed between $410,000 and $690,000, depending on yields and weather. He did not arrive at that method by accident. The turning point came when he was 14, in November 1990, standing with his father near a county auction where a neighbor's machinery line was sold in freezing wind. The neighbor, Dale Runyon, was not reckless, not careless, and not foolish. He had borrowed on expected grain prices, then rates moved against him. Then one poor crop tightened the sequence, and the bank accelerated terms. Gone, foreclosed, auctioned off. Cole watched Dale's wife fold paperwork with both hands, shaking while strangers evaluated a planter they had washed the night before. On the drive home, his father did not give him a speech. He gave him one sentence. Debt is rented time. If weather takes your season, the lender takes your sleep. Cole kept that line and built a whole operating framework around it. He started with practical numbers, not ideology. At 19, he leased 160 acres from a retiring widow at $82 per acre. Total annual rent, $13,120, with half due in March and half after harvest. He bought his first used planter for $2,600 cash from a farm estate sale and spent $740 in parts and 2 weekends replacing worn chains and gauge wheels. In year 1, his corn averaged 141 bushels per acre on leased ground and sold for an average cash price of $2.34, generating gross revenue of $39,608 from corn, plus $11,920 from soybeans on the remainder. After rent, fuel, seed, fertilizer, repairs, crop insurance, and modest family draw, he retained $6,410, small by any headline standard, foundational by his standard. He set a rule that remained unchanged for decades. 30% of net retained earnings would stay liquid, 40% would move to land fund, 30% would cover equipment reserve and contingencies. By the second week of October 1998, he had enough in the land fund to pursue his first purchase. It was 80 acres with moderate soils and drainage trouble on the south edge, listed at $1,125 per acre. Total price, $90,000. He offered $84,000 cash with a 14-day close and took responsibility for tile repair. The seller accepted because certainty beats maybe, especially in rural deals where harvest timing matters. Tile work cost Cole another $11,300 over 2 years, but average yield gain paid that back in less than 4 seasons. He repeated the pattern, slowly and without announcement. 1999. Bought 40 acres at $1,180 per acre. $47,200 cash. 2002. Added 120 acres at $1,490 per acre, $178,800 cash, after 2 years of above-trend soybean margins. 2005. Passed on a 240-acre tract because price implied negative carry at expected rents. 2007. Bought 160 acres at $2,050 per acre, $328,000 cash after a strong grain cycle. 2010. Added 240 acres from an estate at $2,450 per acre, $588,000 cash, with no lender involvement. That sequence explains the 640 acres people could see by 2012, but it does not yet explain the stability they could not see. Cole separated production decisions from ego signals. He did not buy equipment to demonstrate confidence. He bought tools to reduce per-acre cost volatility. When a dealer quoted him $214,000 for a newer tractor package with financing at 5.9%, he priced the true cost over 7 years, including interest, insurance delta, and depreciation risk, then compared it to maintaining his $4,440 plus a secondary older unit. Maintenance route projected $48,000 over 7 years. Financing route projected $297,000 all in. The difference, $249,000, bought either 83 acres of rent at then prevailing rates or a meaningful down payment on land when opportunities appeared. He chose optionality over image every time. As those comparisons accumulated in his notebooks, Cole saw the county's pattern clearly. When one buyer became the assumed answer to every marketing decision, most operators stopped pricing what happened if that answer changed. His daily discipline looked almost boring from the road. He tracked fuel down to tenths, rotated his own tires, rebuilt hydraulic couplers in winter, and kept a notebook with repair intervals tied to engine hours rather than calendar guesses. He shopped auctions in person, not by rumor, and would walk away from 15 lots to buy one. At that same March 2012 sale, where people laughed at his questions, he bought a grain drill for $3,400 cash, a parts lot for $620, and passed on a polished tillage rig that sold for $48,000, financed to a bidder who called it a steal. Cole's notes on that day listed one line underlined twice. Steel does not care about your pride, only your maintenance. His household budget was as deliberate as his field work. Property taxes and insurance on the home place, $6,980. Food, $7,260. Utilities and fuel for household use, $4,920. health insurance and out-of-pocket care, $5,180, clothing and boots, $640, church and local giving, $1,800, miscellaneous and repairs, $1,960, total, $28,740. No vacation debt, no revolving balances, no hidden lease obligations. That simplicity did not make him austere. It made him resilient. When gross revenue landed near the lower end of his range, around $410,000, he still had room. When it reached $690,000 in strong years, he did not inflate fixed costs to match temporary highs. He also made one decision that looked unnecessary in 2012 and looked obvious only years later. He refused to let any single buyer take more than 35% of annual production, even when local ethanol basis looked like easy money. He kept feed relationships in Omaha and York, accepted occasional lower spot bids for risk distribution, and paid for rail access movement rights on storage options most neighbors dismissed as overcautious. The extra planning cost him a few cents some seasons. It preserved strategic freedom every season. So while the younger growers saw a man in patched coveralls, driving a rusted truck and running old iron, they were reading symbols from the wrong ledger. Their visible prosperity was often borrowed from future margins. His visible thrift was purchased by past margins already retained. That is the core tension in Adams County before the crisis ever arrived. One group optimized for expansion under a single favorable assumption, and one man optimized for survival under changing assumptions. In calm years, both approaches looked like success. Only one of them had room for surprise. Surprise arrived at 6:10 on Monday morning, September 18th, 2023, through a 2-paragraph alert from Prairie Horizon Ethanol that spread from phones to radios to kitchen tables before sunrise had cleared the bins. Immediate shutdown, covenant breach, failed refinancing. No new deliveries accepted. Existing schedules suspended pending receivership review. By 6:43, the first call hit Ben Ortiz, who had 92,000 bushels penciled to that plant across October and November slots. By 7:05, Nora Kim had texted 3 landlords asking for 1 week to update her cash flow projections. By 7:40, Lyle and Mason Prewitt were in their pickup outside the coop, silent, staring at a basis board that had not updated yet, but would by noon. Cole read the message once, then printed it, folded it into his ledger, and drove to check moisture on Field 17 because there was still standing corn that had to be cut regardless of what a buyer did. The county board moved faster than anyone expected. In 9 days, local basis went from plus 18 cents to minus 41 cents per bushel. Trucking distance to alternate buyers jumped from 18 miles to 71. Freight plus queue penalties took another 16 cents to 22 cents, depending on wait time. Net result for many operators landed near a 57-cent per bushel hit after all deductions. On a 180-bushel crop over 1,000 acres, that was roughly $102,600 gone from one season's revenue without 1 acre yielding less grain. Arithmetic, not weather, had just changed the year. Cole still looked like the poorest man in line when he stepped into the coop office that Tuesday. Same faded coveralls, same repaired left cuff, same 1999 Silverado, now at 1,300 miles, parked between 2 new heavy-duty pickups with polished wheels and dealer decals. Travis Meek was there, cap pressed, jacket zipped, tablet open to a marketing app with red numbers flickering. Jordan Hale stood beside him with a cup of coffee he forgot to drink. Both men looked at Cole the same way they had looked at him in 2012, but this time they did not laugh. They were waiting to see whether he would panic with them. Before we go any further, if you want to track how one quiet set of decisions turns into a county-wide recovery by 2026, stay with this story to the end and subscribe, because the most important numbers have not appeared yet. At 8:20 that morning, Brent Klein called emergency loan reviews for 27 operations. Brent was not a villain in a clean shirt. He was a lender who believed his own model, and for 7 years that model had looked right. He had told borrowers that local ethanol basis was margin insurance. He had underwritten projections that treated 10 to 20 cents of basis, strength as structural, not cyclical. His clients were not reckless caricatures. They were serious operators trying to keep up with rising land competition, input inflation, and social pressure to appear modern enough to be trusted by landlords. When Prairie Horizon failed, Brent moved into damage control and asked for additional collateral where debt service coverage ratios had broken. Ben Ortiz was the first visible fracture. He had financed a combine and grain cart package for $800,000 total, with $612,000 on the combine, $188,000 on the cart, 7-year amortization at 7.2% after an initial teaser period. Monthly payment, $12,149. Annual debt service, $145,788. His operation could carry that under projected local basis, with normal yields and no major repair surprises. Remove 57 cents per bushel from his expected corn revenue, and the spreadsheet lost about $214,000. He still had grain. He still had skill. He did not have enough cash flow to satisfy both lenders and suppliers on the old schedule. Nora Kim had expanded from 480 to 1,120 rented acres, a move that had looked disciplined in high-margin years. Her exposure across operating note, prepaid inputs, and contract obligations reached $1,140,000. She had counted on quick turns through Prairie Horizon, with tight trucking radius. With the plant closed, she was forced into longer hauls, delayed unload times, and missed 2 supplier terms windows. Once those discounts disappeared and penalties attached, her effective input costs rose while output net fell. Structured liquidation followed, not because she forgot how to farm, but because timing and leverage can trap even competent operators when the market removes one pillar. The Prewitt brothers carried the largest visible burden. Lyle and Mason had borrowed $2,600,000 at variable rates tied to a benchmark they thought would normalize lower. Their reset moved from 5.1% to 9.3%. On that principle, annual interest cost increased by $109,200. That single line item was enough to consume most of their machinery replacement reserve and stress landlord negotiations. By November, they had lost 1,900 leased acres to competing operators with stronger balance sheets or lower debt stress. Their faces at the coffee shop changed that fall. Less talk, longer pauses. 3 days passed before Brent called Cole directly. He framed it as opportunity. Distressed assets were already appearing. If Cole leveraged his land equity, he could scale now while others contracted. Brent offered bridge borrowing at 10.1%, with machinery lanes and flexible covenants in year 1. Cole listened without interruption, then asked one question. What margin assumption makes that loan safe if basis stays below minus 30 cents for 3 years and diesel stays above $4? Brent answered with scenarios, probability language, and an expected recovery curve. Cole thanked him and declined. He did not decline because he feared growth. He declined because he had already priced this branch of reality years earlier. His buyer cap rule remained unchanged at 35% maximum exposure to any single offtake relationship. His storage movement agreement, mocked in better years, allowed up to 120,000 bushels through rail access handling at 19 cents per bushel, plus freight. He had pre-existing cattle feed contracts in Omaha and York that did not offer glamour margins, but they offered schedule reliability. In October 2023, he moved 38,000 bushels through those channels and accepted thinner profit per bushel in exchange for certainty of movement and cash timing. That choice preserved liquidity while others sold into distress queues. By the last week of October, the county extension hall hosted a lender meeting that felt like a courtroom without a judge. 90 chairs, all filled. Brent opened with portfolio exposure slides. He spoke carefully, then less carefully, then candidly. He said the system had been built around assumptions that no longer held. One hand went up after another. Some questions were angry. Most were exhausted. Then Brent turned to Cole, half defensive and half searching, and asked in front of the room why he had never used cheap money to accelerate when rates were low and neighbors were expanding. Cole stood, walked to the front with 3 ledgers, and placed them on the table one by one. 2013 through 2023. 11 full years. The first ledger showed debt service by month. Every line, $0. The second showed machinery interest expense. Every line, $0. The third tracked maintenance and replacement reserve. Average annual maintenance, $47,600. Peer replacement averages for comparable acreage during that window often exceeded $236,000 when financing, depreciation, and insurance deltas were included. Cole then read retained earnings after taxes and family living draw across the 11-year period. Cumulative $2,940,000. He did not lift his voice. He did not editorialize. He just kept reading numbers. He added one page that shifted the room. Buyer concentration percentages by year, with a hard cap line at 35%. Rail access rights contract copied and stapled behind it, signed years before anyone thought it mattered. Handling cost, $0.19 per bushel. Optionality value in a normal year, modest. Optionality value in a buyer collapse, decisive. That was the moment Adams County stopped calling him lucky. They started calling him prepared. Let me stop here and ask you something directly. If your strongest year depends on one buyer staying healthy forever, is that strength or hidden fragility? Leave your answer in the comments, then watch what Cole does next with the advantage he built. The social pressure on him intensified after that meeting. 2 brokers called within 48 hours offering distressed machinery bundles at what looked like deep discounts. One tract manager suggested he could lock up another 1,500 acres quickly while competitors were disorganized. Brent called once more, softer now, saying a moderate leverage structure could still be prudent for a producer in Cole's position. Cole refused each invitation to build an empire from neighbors' losses. He would buy only what his current system could absorb without changing his risk rules. That refusal was not passivity. It was active discipline. During November, he reworked his 2024 input plan with cash purchases staggered to early pay windows where discounts were real and not tied to financing traps. Seed volume was split across suppliers to avoid concentration risk. Nitrogen timing was adjusted to reduce carry exposure. He set aside 6 months of operating cash in a separate account and documented it as untouchable except for crop failure or medical emergency. When diesel softened briefly, he locked a portion of expected use, not all of it because he treated certainty as a tool rather than a prediction contest. In the first week of December, he invited Ben, Nora, Lyle, and Mason to his shop, not for a speech, but for ledgers and coffee. He walked each one through cash conversion timing, fixed versus variable exposure, and buyer concentration limits. Ben stayed late, recalculating payment schedules with realistic basis assumptions. Nora asked for copies of Cole's reserve policy template and rebuilt her 2024 plan around owned and controllable acres instead of maximum acres. Lyle listened more than he spoke, then asked the cleanest question of the night. How much breathing room is enough? Cole answered in 8 words. 6 months cash. More if your debt floats. By the second week of January 2024, flyers were posted for a foreclosure, heavy machinery auction that would test whether this county had learned anything at all. Brent planned to attend. So did 143 others. Cole pulled in with the same Silverado, same cracked mirror, and frost on the hood. If you are learning something from this discipline under pressure, share this story with one producer who still thinks appearances are a balance sheet. He parked at the edge of the lot, engine ticking as it cooled, and walked toward the registration table, carrying a plain folder that held one document no one there expected yet. Formation papers for Fisher Grain Transition Fund, funded with $1,800,000 cash, signed and ready for the first bid. The registration clerk took the folder, flipped through the formation papers, and stopped when she saw the account verification letter from Platte River Trust. Available cash for immediate settlement. $1,800,000. She looked up at Cole, then over his shoulder toward Brent Klein, as if confirming she had read the figure correctly. Cole only said, "Read the use terms too." She did, line by line, because he always asked that way. Equipment purchased through Fisher Grain Transition Fund could not be resold for speculative gain, could not secure variable rate borrowing, and could not move to a single buyer operation above 40% delivery concentration. 5-year, zero-interest use to own contracts. Payments deferred until a positive operating margin year. Mechanical inspection required each winter. The language was plain enough to fit on 4 pages and strict enough to keep people from repeating old mistakes with new paint. Inside the extension hall, the first lots rolled across the screen with borrower numbers instead of names, but everyone knew whose machines they were. Cole sat in the 3rd row with a yellow legal pad. Brent sat 2 chairs away, tie loosened, legal pad untouched. When Lot 12 came up, a 2021 combine package with 1,140 separator hours, Cole drew 1 line on his page and wrote 3 columns. Replacement payment path, maintenance path, transition path. He had made that comparison for 25 years, long before anyone gave it a name. The auctioneer called opening bids at $310,000. Silence held for 4 seconds, then broke. Cole's progression had never depended on a single heroic year. It was built out of unremarkable choices that compounded while no one watched. His own ledgers, copied into the fund packet that morning, showed it with uncomfortable clarity. In 2013, gross farm revenue was $452,880. Operating cost before family draw was $214,430. Taxes and family living were $52,450. Retained earnings closed at $186,000. In 2014, heavy spring moisture cut yield on 2 tracks, yet disciplined input timing and lower machinery cost held retained earnings at $204,000, enough to buy 80 acres at $3,100 per acre, $248,000 cash, funded by prior reserves and that year's surplus. In 2015, grain prices softened and retained earnings dropped to $167,000, but debt service remained $0 and machinery interest remained $0, so no lender timetable forced a bad sale. Then came the years people remember as easy, which were only easy for operators who did not overpromise their future. In 2016, corn averaged 182 bushels on his core ground, soybeans 55, and custom hay contracts added $73,400 gross. Retained earnings, $241,000. In 2017, he passed on 2 high-dollar equipment offers and instead bought 120 acres at $4,050 per acre, $486,000 cash, after retaining $312,000 that year and pulling $174,000 from his land fund. In 2018, rail handling rights renewed for 3 years at 19 cents per bushel movement cost plus freight. Neighbors called it unnecessary overhead. He booked the contract anyway and retained $286,000 after taxes. In 2019, planting delays and basis volatility cut top-line optimism across the county, yet he still retained $259,000 because his fixed obligations were low and optionality was high. By the first week of February 2020, his notes changed tone. Rates were low, dealers were aggressive, and lenders called that window a once-in-a-generation acceleration moment. Cole wrote one sentence in block letters: cheap debt is still debt. That year, he retained $344,000 and bought no major machinery. In 2021, amid stronger prices and intense expansion pressure, he retained $421,000 and purchased 200 acres at $5,700 per acre, $1,140,000 cash, structured through accumulated reserves and a time sale of older grain inventory. In 2022, drought stress on lighter ground reduced corn yields by 17 bushels per acre on average in his southern blocks, but he still retained $296,000 because cash reserves covered input timing, and he did not carry variable notes. In 2023, the ethanol shutdown struck, basis inverted, and he still closed retained earnings at $200,000 to $24,000. 11 years total. $2,940,000 retained after taxes and living. Average annual machinery maintenance, $47,600. Average annual machinery interest, $0. Average annual debt service, $0. That arithmetic sat beside the county's contrast in the same packet. Not as accusation, but as context. Travis Meek, who had laughed in 2012 and later apologized quietly in 2023, had expanded from 520 to 1,340 acres between 2018 and 2022. He financed a 2020 combine for $540,000 at 4.9% variable, a 16-row planter at $214,000, and a dryer upgrade at $168,000 tied to short-term financing that reset twice. When rates climbed, his weighted borrowing cost moved above 8%. Annual finance burden rose past $100,000 to $76,000, and the ethanol basis collapse removed the margin cushion that had made his model look safe. He did not lose for lack of work. He lost because his downside path had no room. Jordan Hale followed a similar map with different timing. He carried a grain leg and storage project totaling $730,000 with a 5-year balloon, expecting high throughput local delivery to keep basis and drying economics favorable. For 2 years, it worked. Then power costs rose, truck lines lengthened, and the plant closure shifted his freight profile from local loops to long hauls. His effective net fell hard enough that refinancing terms moved against him. He entered a court-supervised restructuring in December 2023, kept his home place, surrendered 2 newer units, and returned to a smaller acreage base. Cole visited him once that winter with printed repair schedules and no speeches. Ben Ortiz's numbers were already public by then. $800,000 combine and cart package at 7.2%, $12,149 monthly, $145,788 annual service, plus a projected $214,000 revenue gap after basis and freight changes. Nora Kim, with $1,140,000 in operating and input exposure, faced supplier penalties when 2 terms windows were missed, then entered structured liquidation to protect what she could. Lyle and Mason Prewitt absorbed a rate reset from 5.1 to 9.3% on $2,600,000 and added $109,200 annual interest load that stripped away resilience in one line item. They were serious operators in a system that rewarded concentration until concentration broke. The county learned that lesson in public. By late afternoon that auction day, the hall had the heavy quiet of people seeing familiar mistakes priced in real time. Lot 18 sold below what the original note still carried. Lot 22 drew no bid at the reserve and was held back. Lot 27, one of Ben's essential units, came up with enough life left to matter, but enough wear to scare off image buyers. Cole raised his card. He did not chase every lot. He bought only what fit transition plans already written with named operators and cash flow thresholds. First purchase, $186,000. Second, $74,500. Third, $219,000. He paused after each and wrote intended assignment beside the line item. Ortiz, Kim, Prewitt, shared use. 3 days later, in the first week of February 2024, he called each recipient to the shop and signed contracts one at a time. Ben's agreement covered the combine lot and 1 header, total assigned value, $402,000 after inspection and transport, 0% interest. 5-year schedule, beginning only after a positive margin year. Required reserve deposit each quarter equal to 4% of gross crop receipts until 6 months of operating expenses were held in cash. Nora's package focused on what she needed for 620 manageable acres, not what she had once run at peak expansion. Assigned value, $286,000 across planter, tillage, and grain handling essentials. Lyle and Mason split a reduced machinery set tied to their restructured acreage and custom work plans, assigned value $337,000, with a maintenance checkpoints every 250 engine hours and mandatory fixed-rate financing for any outside borrowing. The crisis did not end because contracts were signed. Input prices still moved. Freight still cost more than it had before. In March 2024, average anhydrous quotes in their area were still roughly 28% above pre-spike norms. Diesel spent weeks above $3.90. Cash rent negotiations remained tense because landowners had seen high years and expected them to persist. But zero-interest transition terms changed one crucial variable: time. Instead of making desperate sales to satisfy monthly machinery notes, these operators could align payments with actual operating performance. Instead of borrowing at 10.1% bridge rates with new liens, they could rebuild reserves first. Cole added a second layer in April, funding $600,000 in emergency grain freight support for 12 farms, administered through vouchers tied to verified delivered bushels and capped per operation to prevent concentration. The math was direct. Total eligible movement under the program reached 2.86 million bushels for that cycle. Average freight relief landed at 21 cents per bushel, enough to restore working margin for operators who were efficient but trapped by distance. Voucher redemption required updated buyer concentration plans, and no farm could use the support while committing more than 40% to one buyer channel. He was not only handing out money, he was underwriting behavior change. Brent watched this with a mix of relief and regret that he no longer tried to hide. At a spring risk workshop in Hastings, he put up two anonymized models side by side. Model A assumed a permanent basis premium and variable rate flexibility. Model B assumed basis shocks, fixed rate discipline, buyer caps, and 6 months of cash. Over a 10-year simulation with one major buyer failure, Model B produced lower peak growth and vastly higher survival odds. Brent said to the room, "I optimized for expansion velocity. Cole optimized for staying power." He had been persuasive for years. Now he was precise. By June 2024, the first measurable outcomes were visible. Ben finished planting without adding new short-term debt and posted a mid-season liquidity ratio above 1.3 for the first time in 2 years. Nor negotiated lower input volatility by paying early from cash on hand and cut per-acre financing drag by more than half. Lyle stabilized 1,050 acres under debt-light fixed terms. Mason shifted heavier into custom spraying and closed 2 consecutive quarters with positive retained earnings after 2 negative years. None of that looked dramatic from the highway. It looked like ordinary fields and ordinary trucks. Underneath, the structure was different. Late one evening that month, Cole pulled back into his yard in the same Silverado. Now past 7,000 miles, mirror still cracked, tailgate still stubborn. He set the legal pad on the kitchen table next to a cup ring older than some of the machinery, now under transition contracts. On the top page, he wrote 4 totals from that day's reconciliations. Fund deployed to equipment, $1,025,500. Freight vouchers committed, $600,000. Remaining uncommitted cash, $174,500. Delinquency rate on transition contracts, 0.00%. Then he wrote one line beneath the numbers: "No rescue without rules." He closed the pad, turned off the light, and prepared for another 5 o'clock morning because the crop still needed him before sunrise. At 4:52 the next morning, the yard light snapped on above the machine shed, and Cole was already inside with a grease gun in one hand and a printed balance sheet in the other. He had agreed to meet Brent and 2 trustees from Platte River Trust at 7:30, not because he needed permission to keep helping people, but because rumors had started moving faster than facts. By sunrise, the story in town had split 3 ways. One version said he had a silent investor. One said he had sold land quietly. One said the fund was mostly symbolic. Cole preferred arithmetic to rumor, so he drove into Hastings with the same cracked mirror reflecting the same rusted bed rail and put the numbers on a table where everyone could see them. The meeting took place in a conference room above a title office on Burlington Avenue, with bad coffee and a humming vent, that made pauses sound longer than they were. Brent arrived first, legal pad open this time. Ben Ortiz came in with his hat in both hands. Nora Kim sat near the door with a binder of revised projections. Lyle and Mason Pruitt took seats side by side, boots dusted white from dry gravel. Travis Meek and Jordan Hale came without speaking much, both invited by Brent because their restructurings now depended on whether local recovery pathways were real or just hopeful language. At 7:41, the trustee, Elaine Rudd, asked Cole for proof of capacity beyond the transition fund already announced. Cole slid over a notarized personal statement dated June 30th, 2024. It listed 1,040 owned acres at a conservative market value of $7,488 per acre, total $7,787,520. Grain inventory net of hedging obligations, $418,300. Cash and equivalents outside the fund, $1,146,900. Machinery and implement book value, after depreciation, $326,400. Liabilities, total, $0. Net worth on that date, $9,679,120. He then placed a second page beside it, showing pledged commitments already made. Fisher Grain Transition. Fund $1,800,000, emergency freight support $600,000, and contingent maintenance reserve backstop of up to $240,000 if 3 or more recipient farms suffered simultaneous major breakdowns before harvest close. No one spoke for nearly 10 seconds. The vent kept humming. Brent read the liabilities line twice, then pressed his thumb against the margin, as if to keep the paper still. Ben looked at Cole the way a man looks at a map he wishes he had found 5 years earlier. Nora exhaled and leaned back, not from relief exactly, but from clarity. Travis stared at the acreage line and said quietly, "I thought you were just scraping by." Cole answered in 5 words, "I was pricing risk, not image." The reveal did not become a celebration. It became a pivot. Elaine asked whether he intended to convert this into a private acquisition vehicle after distress prices fell further. Cole said no. He handed over fund bylaws requiring that at least 85% of deployed capital serve operator stabilization, not ownership transfer, and any land transaction tied to the fund had to be either cost-basis leaseback or fixed-price option to active producers with reserve requirements attached. Jordan, who had entered restructuring court in December, asked whether those rules were flexible in a bad weather year. Cole said they were strict on leverage and flexible on timing. No variable debt, delayed payments if margin is negative. That is the whole point. By the 3rd week of July, the paperwork became machinery moving down roads at 20 miles per hour with hazard lights blinking in morning heat. Ben received the first transition unit assignment in full, inspected and documented, with a service checklist attached to the contract. Assigned value, $402,000. Required annual principal target, $80,400 only in profitable years, otherwise deferred without penalty and re-amortized across remaining term. He harvested earlier than planned that season because downtime fell by 41 hours compared with the prior year, a direct difference traced to fewer in-field failures and 1 preventive bearing replacement funded before breakdown instead of after. Nora's agreement closed 3 days later. Her package totaled $286,000, including a planter, a tillage unit, and grain handling essentials sized to 620 acres she could control without overstretch. She signed a covenant that capped any one buyer at 38% and required monthly cash reserve reporting through harvest. In August, she used early pay cash discounts on fertilizer and saved $18,740 versus the prior spring structure. Her per-acre financing drag, which had been crushing in 2023, dropped below half of its previous level. The margin was still thin, but thin and stable is survivable. Lyle and Mason split the $337,000 package with different operating tracks by design. Lyle kept row crop focus on 1,050 acres under fixed-rate terms and retired 2 high-cost short notes entirely. Mason moved deeper into custom, spraying with a rebuilt schedule and lower fixed burden, using shared equipment hours only where overlap made sense. Their contract included a simple clause Cole insisted on. If either brother posted 2 consecutive positive retained earnings quarters, 10% of that surplus had to move into a 6-month reserve account before any discretionary spending. They agreed without arguing because they had lived the alternative. Cole's generosity widened past machinery before August ended, but it never loosened into vague charity. The freight voucher program already covered 12 farms. He added a bookkeeping grant pool of $72,000 for 6 beginning operators, $12,000 each, paid directly to certified farm accounting services that produced monthly accrual statements and buyer concentration reports. Recipients included Tara Voss at 340 acres, Caleb Dunn at 410, and Eli Navarro at 290. All good field operators who had been making business decisions from checkbook snapshots instead of full-cost statements. Within 1 quarter, Tara identified a recurring drying cost leak worth $9,300 annualized. Caleb renegotiated 1 trucking lane and cut delivered basis loss by 8 cents per bushel on soybeans. Eli canceled a high-fee input financing product and shifted to staged cash purchases, reducing projected interest expense by $6,140. He also funded mechanic apprenticeships with exact terms, because older equipment only saves money when someone local can keep it working. Total allocation: $108,000 over 2 years, administered through the community college in Hastings and a partner shop in Juniata. 3 adult apprentices entered the first cohort: Dana Reek, Owen Schultz, and Marco Lee. Each received tuition, tool credits, and a wage supplement tied to documented field service hours on transition fund machines. By November, average wait time for critical repairs among recipient farms dropped from 6.2 days to 2.4 days during peak harvest pressure. That single operational improvement protected more yield than any motivational speech could. Brent kept attending these signings and reviews, not as gatekeeper now, but as witness and occasional translator for lenders who still thought in old templates. In one September meeting at the Extension Hall, he explained the shift using numbers even resistant landlords could track. Under prior leverage structures, 5 core recipients were facing combined annual machinery and variable interest burden above $611,000. Under transition agreements and fixed-rate resets, that burden fell to $238,000 equivalent in positive margin years, with 0 required machinery interest and payment pauses during losses. This is not mercy math, Brent told them. This is solvency math. If you are the one in your family who handles risk decisions, you already know how non-trivial this shift is. The difference between a delayed payment and a missed payment is often the difference between continuity and liquidation. In October, Cole sat at the same kitchen table where he had written "No Rescue Without Rules" and ran the deeper examination that finally quieted the last lucky narrative. He built two side-by-side 10-year models using actual county yields, actual basis swings, and actual fuel and input ranges from 2014 through projected 2024 close. Model 1 mirrored the conventional expansion path with variable rate machinery debt, higher replacement cycles, and single buyer concentration above 55%. Model 2 mirrored his path: zero machinery debt, maintenance first capital policy, buyer cap below 40%, and 6-month cash reserve discipline. Model 1 generated higher paper growth in 4 of the first 6 years. Peak acreage controlled rose faster. Peak gross revenue looked stronger. But over the full period, cumulative interest and finance drag reached $1,482,600 on comparable production scale. And the 2023 buyer shock force distress actions that erased prior gains. Model 2 posted lower peak growth and lower social visibility, but cumulative retained earnings reached $2,940,000 from 2013 to 2023 and remained positive through the shutdown year. Then funded direct intervention in 2024 without external borrowing. Cole wrote one line in the margin: "Volatility punishes fixed promises." He then ran recipient trajectories with conservative assumptions. Ben's 5-year path, assuming average corn yield of 176 and soybean yield of 53 with basis still weaker than pre-closure norms, showed full ownership transfer of assigned equipment by 2029 and projected cumulative retained earnings of $684,000 if reserve rules held. Nora's resized operation, at a modeled 9.1 to 9.8% net margin band, reached debt-light stability by year 3 with projected cumulative retained earnings of $412,000 by 2028. Lyle's fixed-term structure showed steady recovery with lower upside, but much lower collapse risk. Mason's custom spraying plus reduced row crop exposure produced the most variable monthly numbers and the healthiest annual cash conversion once seasonality was priced correctly. The multiplier effect appeared only when he added everyone together. Across 12 freight-supported farms and 5 direct machinery transition operators, the modeled avoided liquidation acreage totaled 6,740 over 3 seasons. At a conservative $7,950 per acre valuation, that was $53,583,000 in operating land base kept in productive hands instead of forced churn. Combined projected interest avoided over 5 years, compared with bridge borrow alternatives near 10.1%, came to $2,204,000. Cole did not call it legacy. He called it fewer auctions. By early November, outcomes were still provisional, but unmistakable. Delinquency across transition contracts remained 0.00%. Reserve compliance among primary recipients was 92%, with one temporary waiver documented after a hail claim delay and corrected within 30 days. Average buyer concentration among participating farms fell from 61% pre-shutdown dependence to 37%. Freight voucher cost per protected bushel settled at $0.209, almost exactly on program design. Brent reviewed the sheet, nodded once, and said, "We treated one plant like permanent infrastructure. It was temporary margin. That was the error." Cole folded the papers, set them back in the same plain folder, and headed for the door because the second load of beans would not haul itself. Outside, his Silverado started on the second turn. Exhaust thin in cold air, tailgate still needing a knee. Travis was standing by his newer truck when Cole walked past. "You could buy 10 of these," Travis said, glancing at the rust. Cole shook his head. "One runs fine." Then he drove back toward the bins where wealth still looked like patched fabric and old steel, and proved itself only in what it allowed other families to keep. He drove back toward the bins, and by the time the second soybean load was weighed that afternoon, Ben had already sent proof of his first reserve transfer, $11,420 into the restricted cash account tied to his transition contract. Cole printed the receipt, clipped it behind Ben's page, and made no speech about it. By the third week of November, Nor had submitted 3 straight monthly accrual reports on time, each one showing the same pattern: smaller acreage, tighter cost control, better sleep. Lyle and Mason turned in engine-hour logs with maintenance signatures from Dana Reek, who had gone from apprentice to indispensable in less than 1 season. 3 days before Christmas 2024, Elaine, Rudd, and Brent came back to the same Burlington Avenue conference room to review whether the model could survive a full year rather than a press cycle. It could. Across the 5 direct transition operators, combined machinery-related cash outflow was down 58.6% compared with 2023 obligations. Reserve compliance held above 90%. Freight vouchers had protected 2.86 million bushels at an average relief of $0.209 per bushel, and verified net realized price improved enough to keep 12 farms from forced year-end liquidation. The first small cascade had begun. Not dramatic wealth creation, just avoided collapse. By April 2025, it was visible in ordinary details. Ben no longer skipped preventive service to chase a payment deadline. Nora negotiated seed volume from a position of cash timing instead of fear and cut total input cost by $27,340 against her 2023 structure. Lyle locked fixed-rate terms at 6.2% on a reduced principal stack and stopped bleeding from rate resets. Mason's custom spraying calendar filled early, and he posted his first full positive retained quarter at $38,600, then another at $44,200, meeting the contract trigger that forced 10% into reserve before any discretionary spend. He complained about the rule once, then thanked Cole quietly after harvest. In the second week of July 2025, the bookkeeping grants produced their first full-year comparisons. Tara Voss, farming 340 acres, moved from scattered checkbook management to monthly accrual discipline and lifted net margin from 4.1% to 8.7%, largely by catching preventable drying and trucking leakage. Caleb Dunn used lane renegotiation and buyer diversification to recover 11 cents per bushel on soybeans across 41,000 bushels, about $4,510 that season. Eli Navarro cut financing costs enough to retain an extra $8,020 and used it to prepay repairs before fall. None of them became rich that year. All of them became harder to knock over. By the first frost in October 2025, Dana, Owen Schultz, and Marco Lee had logged 1,940 combined field service hours under the apprenticeship program. Average peak harvest repair wait time on participating farms dropped again from the 2.4 days to 1.6. That one metric had a dollar value: fewer delayed acres, less weather exposure, lower emergency hauling. Cole's own records estimated preserved gross margin at $312,000 countywide from reduced downtime alone. The fund did not just transfer money, it rebuilt local repair capacity that debt cycles had hollowed out. At Harvest 2026, the outcomes finally matched the discipline. Ben Ortiz was current on all obligations and had reached 60% ownership of his assigned combine package, $241,200 in principal credited under zero interest terms. His debt service ratio, once the number everyone worried about, stabilized above lender minimums with room left. Nora Kim held steady at 620 owned and leased acres, carried no variable notes, and closed the year at a 9.4% net margin on verified statements. Lyle Prewitt operated 1,050 acres under debt-light fixed structures and rebuilt landlord trust by paying exactly when promised. Mason Prewitt, after 2 negative years, finished 2026 with positive retained earnings, driven by custom spraying and disciplined row crop exposure. The multiplier effect was no slogan by then. Fisher Grain Transition Fund began with $1,800,000 in strict terms. By December 2026, principal repayments and recycled allocations had financed additional stabilization steps for 4 more operators without outside leverage, while delinquency across active contracts remained below 1%. Freight support, bookkeeping grants, and mechanic apprenticeships together touched 17 farms, and the avoided liquidation land base still tracked near 6,700 acres. At an $8,000 per acre reference value, that was more than $53 million in productive ground kept from panic churn. More important, it was families still farming. Brent Klein's resolution came without theater. He retired to Kearney in late 2026, sold his lender stock position, and kept one commitment each year, a single extension risk seminar where he put his own prior model on screen and walked people through where it failed. He used his name, not anonymized examples. He explained how treating temporary basis premium as permanent infrastructure had distorted underwriting, and he now opened every seminar with one line: concentration risk is a debt problem first and a market problem second. He and Cole were not close friends, but they were no longer opponents. They exchanged spreadsheets twice a year and argued politely about assumptions. The other men who had once laughed at Cole also reached clearer endings. Travis Meek downsized to 780 acres, sold 2 high-payment units, and rebuilt on fixed terms with lower visibility and better sleep. He now tells younger growers to price downside first. Jordan Hale completed court-supervised restructuring, kept his home place, and shifted storage strategy toward service fees instead of speculative throughput promises. He still drives newer equipment than Cole, but he no longer finances image upgrades. Dale Runyon, whose auction had marked Cole at 14, had passed years earlier, but his daughters received an anonymous envelope in 2025 containing a paid-off property tax balance on their mother's house for 3 years, $18,240 total. They later learned where it came from. Elaine Rudd remained trustee at Platte River Trust and became the formal compliance monitor for the transition contracts, publishing annual plain language summaries so rumors could not outrun facts. Tara, Caleb, and Eli each renewed accounting service without subsidy by 2026 because the discipline paid for itself. Dana accepted a full-time regional field mechanic role and trained 2 new apprentices. Owen opened a small repair bay in Juniata with used tooling and no startup debt. Marco stayed with the partner shop and specialized in older hydraulic systems, the unglamorous work that kept old iron earning. Cole kept exactly what he said he would keep. Same 1999 Silverado, now beyond 430,000 miles. Same cracked passenger mirror, same tailgate that needed a knee, same patched coveralls for shop work. By county assessor and verified statements in late 2026, he held 1,040 acres valued at $8,320,000 plus $1,260,000 in cash and equivalents, with liabilities still at $0. He formalized an annual philanthropic commitment of $180,000. Freight vouchers where distance shocks hit hardest, mechanics apprenticeships to protect maintenance capacity, and beginning farmer bookkeeping grants so small mistakes would not compound into foreclosure. His 1978 John Deere 4440 still ran, still started in cold weather with patience, and still did paid work because he maintained it better than many people maintain new debt. If you have followed this story all the way here and want more cases where arithmetic beats appearance, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Then leave a comment with your answer to one specific question. What is the highest percentage of your production that should ever go to one buyer? And share this with one person who thinks looking prosperous and being solvent are the same thing, because those are different ledgers. By the end, Adams County had learned to read the right ledger. The farmer in worn coveralls was never the one barely hanging on. He was the one who refused to rent his future, who priced risk when markets looked easy, who kept debt from turning one bad season into a permanent ending. When the premium vanished, the borrowed shine vanished with it. The discipline remained. Near sundown, after the 2026 books were closed, Cole backed the Silverado to the machine shed, lifted the tailgate with his knee, and set down a box of filters beside the old 4440. Dust moved in the amber light. The engine ticked as it cooled. Across the county, fewer auction flyers went up that winter. That was his kind of wealth. Cole stood a moment longer in the amber dust, then opened the box and set the new filters in a neat row on the workbench beside the old ones he had tagged with a grease pencil. Fuel, hydraulic, air. Used parts on the left, replacements on the right. He wrote the hour meter reading for the 4440 in his notebook, 11,982.4, and slid that page under a clear cover in the same black binder that held every service interval since 2003. The black binder went back into the metal drawer below the bench, directly under the plain folder that still held the original formation papers for Fisher Grain Transition Fund, the account verification letter, and the first signed contracts from February 2024. Nothing stayed loose in his shop for long. By the first Monday of January 2027, that same folder sat open on the extension hall table while recipients checked in one by one for annual review. Elaine Rudd called each name and matched signatures to payment logs. Ben Ortiz came first, carrying a folder thick enough to bow in the middle. He laid down quarterly statements, reserve account proof, and maintenance receipts with Dana Reek's initials on 3-line items. Elaine ran a finger down the page and said, "Principal credited through year end, $289,400. Reserve balance, $106,800. Ben nodded and looked at Cole. "I thought that rule was punishment the first year. It was oxygen the second year." Nora Kim sat next to him and waited until Ben finished before sliding over her reports. Her 620-acre plan had stayed exactly at 620, despite 2 offers to add rented ground at rates that would have looked tempting in a coffee shop conversation. She had written one line at the top of her year-end sheet: "No growth without cash margin." Elaine read her numbers out loud for the room because Nora asked her to. Gross receipts, $1,104,300. Net margin, 9.6%. Variable rate exposure, $0. Buyer concentration, highest single channel, 34%. Nora reached into her bag, pulled out a cashier check for $57,200 toward principal on her assigned package, and placed it face up. "I am not paying for speed anymore," she said. "I am paying for control." Lyle and Mason Pruitt came in together, but filed separate reports as required. Lyle's fixed-term row crop operation at 1,050 acres posted modest growth, then stopped there by design. He had turned down an additional 300 acres in late fall because the rent terms would have forced thinner reserves. Mason, who once absorbed shock like he was built for it, now carried printed monthly cash flow statements with color tabs marking seasonal swings in custom spraying revenue. He handed Elaine a transfer confirmation for reserve contribution, then told Cole, "2 years ago, I would have hidden this page. Now it is the first page." His retained earnings for 2026, $128,400, and first quarter 2027 pre-bookings were already covering baseline overhead. The cascade that started with 5 contracts was now measurable in faces and timing, not just in total dollars. Tara Voss arrived from morning chores with mud still drying on her boots and showed Caleb Dunn how she structured drying cost alerts in her accounting software so she could catch leaks before they compounded. Caleb had moved 2026 soybean delivery into 3 channels and brought printed settlement sheets proving a weighted 9-cent per bushel improvement over his old single-lane habit. Eli Navarro had paid off the last high-fee input product and now used staged cash purchases tracked against a 6-month reserve floor. Dana had moved from apprenticeship into lead field mechanic for transition units and now trained 2 new apprentices under the same program design. Owen Schultz, now operating his Juniata repair bay debt-free, had posted a winter service calendar full by December. Marco Lee brought a hydraulic failure analysis sheet that cut repeat downtime on older units by nearly a third. They were all still one weather event away from stress, because that is farming, but they were no longer one invoice away from collapse. At the back of the room, Brent Klein watched those pages move from hand to hand like a man reading a language he used to mispronounce. He was fully retired in Kearney, as planned, and his yearly extension seminar had become standing room only for younger lenders and older operators who wanted plain arithmetic without optimism theater. In March 2027, he asked Cole for permission to use the original 2013 through 2023 ledger copies in a training session. Cole agreed on one condition: no names removed from Brent's own decisions. Brent kept that condition. He put his prior model and his corrected model on opposite screens, then said, "I treated recurring premium like bedrock. It was weather, not bedrock." After the seminar, 3 regional lending officers adopted a written buyer concentration stress test before approving operating expansions. Brent sent Cole the policy memo the same evening, outcome documented, thread closed. Travis Meek's ending came quieter than his beginning. He met Cole at the same Tri-County yard where he had laughed in 2012 and stood with both hands in his coat pockets while a used header warmed up in a cold wind. "I used to think old meant behind," he said. "Now I think paid for means ahead." His 780-acre operation was stable, his highest interest notes were gone, and he had become the person in his own coffee group who asked younger growers to read lean lines before bidding. Jordan Hale, who once built around throughput optimism, now ran storage as a service business with fixed handling fees and transparent schedules. He still had newer equipment than Cole, but every replacement decision had to clear a cash test first. Neither man tried to rewrite his history. Both men changed it. In the second week of June 2027, Dale Runyon's daughters invited Cole to their porch for iced tea and handed him a folded tax statement stamped paid through 20 to 27. They knew by then who had sent the anonymous payment in 2025 and the follow-up payment in 2026. Cole told them he had done it because their father's auction had taught him more than most classrooms. One of the daughters, Erin Runyon Cole, no relation, asked why he never told anyone. He answered, "Some debts are not bank debts." They cried a little, then laughed when his truck tailgate stuck and he had to bump it with his knee exactly the way the county had seen for years. By harvest 2027, Elaine's compliance report showed the fund's full ledger in plain language. Original capital $1,800,000, cumulative equipment allocations $1,446,700, freight support deployed $600,000, bookkeeping grants and apprenticeship allocations $180,000 annually under Cole's philanthropic commitment. Principal repaid and recycled $712,300. Active contract delinquency 0.8%. Corrected within policy windows. Participating farms now 17 with documented buyer concentration. Average 36%. The once underlined phrase in Cole's legal pad, "No rescue without rules," appeared on the first page of the public summary, with his permission. The cup ring on his kitchen table was still there. The legal pad with the first 4 totals was archived in a drawer, page corners curled, numbers unchanged. On an October evening after the last beans were binned and the yard finally quieted, Cole parked the Silverado beside the 4440 and shut the engine down. Mileage read 439,118. Cracked mirror still cracked. Rust still rust. He checked the 4440 again, wiped a film of dust from the hood with his sleeve, and listened to the ticking metal cool in the dark. The tractor remained what it had always been in this story, and not nostalgia, but proof that maintenance beats image when image is financed and maintenance is paid. Adams County stopped making that confusion. People still wore clean jackets to meetings, still bought new equipment when the math supported it, still argued about markets and weather and seed traits the way farmers always will. But they read risk differently now. They asked where the reserve sat. They asked what happened if basis broke. They asked whether growth required rented time. The farmer who looked poorest had been richest in the only way that mattered. He could absorb shock, keep promises, and help others do the same without borrowing tomorrow to survive today. Before dawn the next morning, the yard light clicked on again. Cole stepped out in patched coveralls, crossed the gravel, and started the old 4440 on the second try.